Hi everyone, it's Mrs. Gifford here, and I am going to talk to you about Lesson 9.5, solving quadratic equations with the quadratic formula. So up to this point, we've done all this graphing with solving quadratic equations, and we found where the graph has crossed the x-axis to find those solutions. And now what we're going to do is learn a bit of a shortcut or another way of finding those solutions. So, like I said, solving the quadratic formula. So first question, what is the quadratic formula? So as we're looking at this, it's x equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. One thing I want to point out to you is this part of the quadratic formula. That should look familiar to you. If you're thinking the line of symmetry, absolutely. So when are we going to use the quadratic formula? That's when it's not easy to solve by graphing or by factoring. We're going to take numbers from that original quadratic equation and just plug it in and get our answer. So the first thing to consider is there a trick with the quadratic formula to know how many solutions we have? And that answer is yes. It's called the discriminant. So like I said on the previous slide, we already have this part that I'm going to put in that red rectangle. This red rectangle, again, is our axis of symmetry or our line of symmetry. The discriminant is the information underneath the square root symbol. And depending on what the value is with that information, that's going to tell us how many solutions there are. So this diagram shows how many solutions there are based on the value of the discriminant. So the first one is if underneath that radical symbol it ends up being a negative number, like this negative 16, then there are going to be no solutions. If, when you plug your numbers in and you get 0 for your discriminant, there's going to be one solution. If the number underneath that radical is going to be positive, then we know that there are going to be two solutions. Again, if it's negative, 0 solutions. 0, 1 solution, positive, 2 solutions. So let's look into getting some examples and using the quadratic formula. So here's our first example, x squared minus 12x equals negative 20, and we're going to solve this using the quadratic formula. So the first thing that we should always be in the habit of doing is getting this one side equal to 0. And so I've done that by adding 20 to both sides. And now we're going to go through and label what our a, b, and c are. As a reminder, the general form of a quadratic equation is ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So in looking at this equation, what are your a, b, and c? If you're thinking 1 for a, negative 12 for b, and 20 for c, you are on track. And once you identify those three numbers, then you're going to take that information and plug it into the quadratic formula to find our solutions. So as with everything else, we're going to show our step. Our b is negative 12. The opposite of that is positive 12, plus or minus. We have negative 12 squared minus 4 times 1 times 20. Extend my square root. All over 2 times 1. So when I go through and do that, it's going to be 12 plus or minus the square root of 144 minus 80 over 2. And I have x equals 12 plus or minus the square root of 64 over 2. And then from here, I look inside this radical and I notice that 64 is a perfect square. So I'm going to keep my 12, I'm going to keep my plus or minus, square root of 64 is 8, and I still have my 2. From here, let me go back for a second. First of all, I recognize that this 64 is a positive number underneath that radical symbol. So based on what we talked about, this is the value of the discriminant. That means we should end up with 2 solutions. So once you simplify underneath the radical symbol, then you say, okay, I've got 2 different solutions. One of them is going to be x equals 12 plus 8 divided by 2. And the other one is going to be x equals 12 minus 8 divided by 2. So I'm just going to do this one since I have the red marker. 12 minus 8 is 4, which gives us 2 when we divide it by 2. And 12 plus 8 is 20, divided by 2 is 10. So if we were to take a look at this graph, the two solutions for the equation x squared minus 12x equals negative 20 are 10 and 2. We're going to do one more example just to make sure that we are on track with this quadratic formula. So here's example number 2. We have 3x squared minus 5x equals 12. Again, we need to make sure that our one side is 0, and in this case, it already is. So that's one less step for us to do. So now we're going to identify our A, B, and C. Why don't you pause the video real quick and take a look at A, B, and C and write them down. And then when you're done, hit play. So if you said 3, negative 5, and negative 12, for each of those letters, you are correct. Once we have those values, we're going to plug them into the quadratic formula again. So x equals the opposite of b. So we have 5 plus or minus square root of negative 5 squared minus 4 times 3 times negative 12. Two things I want to point out here. First of all, notice I'm putting this negative number inside parentheses. That's to remind me that when I plug negative 5 squared into the calculator, it's ensuring that it's doing negative 5 times negative 5. If we don't use the parentheses and do negative 5 squared, it's going to give us the opposite value that we need. So we need to make sure we're using that. The second thing to point out is that we have a negative 4 and a negative 12 here. So we need to make sure that we keep track of that as we are recording the value of the discriminant. Continuing then with that quadratic formula, I need to do 2 times a, which is 2 times r3. So continuing with this, then I have 5 plus or minus, we have 25 minus 4 times negative 36 all over 6. And I have 5 plus or minus square root of 25, whoops, plus, and then 4 times 36 gives us 144, still all over 6. 5 plus or minus square root of 169, all over 6 again. And again, I know that the square root of 169 is going to be 13. So then I know my two solutions are going to be 5 plus 13 divided by 6 and 5 minus 13 divided by 6. 5 plus 13 is 18, and 18 divided by 6 is 3. There's one solution, and then 5 minus 13 is negative 8. Divided by 6 gives us negative 4/3. So there is our second solution. So one thing I just want to close you out to help you remember what the quadratic formula is a little song for us to play.